and thank you all. I'm truly honored to be here in a panel with such big names. I can tell you that. I really admire the work of the people that came before me, so I needed to say that. So I work in a field called theoretical neuroethics, so at the intersection between ethics and neuroscience. I'm a philosopher, so I don't do empirical research, but I review the findings on the neural basis of moral behavior to understand if we may reconceptualize our moral theories, if and how we can do that. So there is a lot of interpretation around the results in neuroscience. So let me start. So let me start with a dilemma that everyone maybe knows. If you want an example that is related to economic and corporate, maximizing utility as profit, for example, in corporate culture, has been a sort of a basic premise of this kind of culture. But what if and when you have to sacrifice your customers, your clients, your investors, your stakeholders? And here we get to dilemma that we call, well, it has been called, this kind of dilemmas have been called the fruit flies of the social neuroscience. That is exactly like those little tiny insects that geneticists use experimentally. So they are really the basics of social neuroscience. So this is the trolley dilemma. And the majority of people would say in this version that we call the bystander, so would say that they would actually switch the lever to save one person instead of making this train hit and kill this 5 person entrapped on the rails. So the majority of people would respond yes, 85%, would basically give what we call an utilitarian response, maximizing consequences and utility. So this is why you see Bentham and Mill there. But if I ask you another kind of dilemma, and this is called the footbridge, and I ask you, would you maybe, yes, sir. Would you maybe, so there is a very heavy guy who is passing by on a footbridge. You are on this footbridge. Would you maybe push this heavy man out from the footbridge to save the 5 people entrapped on the rails? And the majority of people say no. They would respond, we say, like a Kantian, because they would not use this person merely as a means. That was the Kantian maxim. So the reaction to the second dilemma is basically this, very emotional. So there is a very famous model that has been introduced by Joshua Green to justify, to say how we should respond to this model. So it's not just a descriptive model. He contributed a lot to understand what are the areas that are involved in this kind of judgments. But it's also, it purported a normative conclusion, so that we should be always utilitarian. So in the footbridge, we should answer yes. And his response depends on the fact that he actually says that in there are 2 routes to get to this conclusion. When you get to the non-utilitarian choice, you basically activate your emotion. It's an emotional route. So these are the areas that are involved. Amygdala, you heard about before. It activates. Then you have, the conflict, anterior cingulate cortex, that is always activated. Then from amygdala, you go to ventromedial prefrontal cortex, another emotional area. But the reason why Joshua Green thinks that we should be always utilitarians is that so we should say yes to the footbridge. Is it because basically the footbridge follow what he calls a rational route? So you have the activation of an area in particular, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's this area here, and some others, like inferior parietal lobe, and that it's basically considered to be the center of cognitive control. So we should control, we should be rational and utilitarian. So I think that this model actually hides a sort of what I call the three myths of self-control, three stereotypes that are really traditionally rooted. And these myths are the fact that self-control is rational, the fact that self-control is unconscious, and the fact that self-control is moral, and intending moral as radically utilitarian. And I'll tell you what I mean for radically utilitarian, but if you want to know it before, is instrumentally, to cause instrumental harm. So I won't speak about conscious stuff today, but I will focus on rationality and morality. So the most important thing is that I think that this model historically represents very well what we call the Victorian picture of the mind, brain, and morality. So the Victorian era is an era named after a woman that, you know, Queen Victoria, 63 years of reign. But despite being an era named after a woman, it was an era of man intellectuals. And the kind of values that these intellectuals were spreading were actually values about rationality, self-empowerment, hard work, profit, masculinity, and those people are very, very influential people. So one is John Hagling's Jackson, a very important, the founder of British neurology, Victorian neurology. I will tell you about in a minute about brain architecture. We have a model of consciousness. Self-control is about consciousness. We have popular books like Self-Help by Samuel Smiles for self-empowerment and social climb. And we have the two utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham, who is chronologically a little before, and John Stuart Mill. So self-control is a Victorian term and corresponds to willpower. So the idea we have to exercise this capacity of rationality against akrasia, what Aristotle called akrasia, so the weakness of will. And we have to suppress our emotion for that. So let me also say that I said masculinity, but we have to remind that John Stuart Mill, an utilitarian, was actually in favor of, he was a defender of a universal suffrage, and he actually put the basis of the feminist movement in the liberal thinking. So things are a bit more complicated than that. But let me go to... So John Hagling's Jackson, despite being very famous for epilepsy, was the first to depict this idea of the brain as hierarchical. So this architecture is the idea that we have lower structure of the brain, which actually corresponds to lower functions, and higher structures of the brain structurally that corresponds to higher functions. So we have the behavioral and physiological responses in the lower structure, the brainstem. We have the limbic and paralimbic system, so middle emotions, here orange, and then we have the neocortex, the higher structure. This kind of view was also very much influenced by evolution. So the idea is that since the higher it's very, very modern. So since the higher structures are the ones that are the most recent, evolutionarily speaking, they are the best. So they produce the best thinking, okay? So self-control is a Victorian term, but we have it in antiquity. It's just we have it named in another way. So Plato used to speak about temperance, or sophrosine in Greek. And here you have also an allegory used much, which is the charioteer allegory. The charioteer of Delphi you can see in the museum here. So the self, which is the charioteer, is controlling two horses. One is rationality, one is emotion. Okay, so, and you can also see that temperance is one cardinal virtue. So self-control was moralized from antiquity. And this means that it's exactly what we do now. So when we say that inability to diet, cheating on your partner, procrastinating at work are irresponsible behavior. And we also think that disorders of self-control corresponds to diminished or lack of responsibility. So we always moralize self-control. So what is self-control? Self-control is considered to have two components. So one is inhibition. You inhibit an automatic, you suppress an automatic and tempting response in order to delay gratification and get a better response at time two. So the emotions are involved in the first phase. As I said, you heard about the striatum before, the intermediate prefrontal cortex. Then you apply your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so you may delay gratification. And sometimes also a social cognition area is involved as well, which is tempoparietal junction. But basically, this is a top-down model, okay? So you go from rationality and suppress what is happening in the emotional area. So the hot and the cool system, okay? So the striatum is the hot, the cool system is in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we have various tests to measure and assess self-control. And for example, to assess inhibition, we have a famous test. There are many, but a famous test is a test in which is this test in which you don't have to read the words you see, which is a word naming color, but you have to name the color you see. It takes time. It's called Stroop test, and it's a test of inhibition. Then for the delay of gratification, we have a paradigm from the 1960s introduced by Michel at Stanford. So these are children that are left in front of a marshmallow for an incredible time for them, 15, 20 minutes, with the promise they will get 2 marshmallows if they wait and don't eat the marshmallow. So they have to resist and delay gratification. So these are measures that are used for self-control. And interestingly, so these measures, so the inhibition measures and the delay measures sometimes do not converge very well. So they are very, very heterogeneous. So we need to understand how they interact. So there are twin studies that say that self-control is heritable at 60%, but we still have that 40%. So environmental factors count a lot. So parenting, social models, and in general, I mean, I won't speak about predictions because they are not relevant here, but let me say that those kind of tests, like the marshmallow test, gave us a lot of empirical evidence about the strategies that also children use to exercise their self-control. So if we look at domains, so self-control is very domain-specific also in the same individual. Like, for example, you may be good at working, but not at dieting, and so on. But if you look, so the thickness of the layers identify how much desire people in general have on specific domains, and you immediately see, so the blue is food, eating, then we have sleeping, then we have sex, social contract. So these are domains in which people really struggle for their self-control because they are basic needs. So why I think self-control is emotional? Well, there is literature, especially in psychology and neuroscience, is converging on the fact that very good delayers of gratification, so people who are very good in their self-control, they actually do not use willpower that much, because willpower is really a very short-term capacity, so it may fail very easily. So what they do, they basically find strategies to regulate their emotions. For example, sometimes they are not even so much tempted by the responses, or they put themselves automatically, or maybe they learn strategies like this in situations in which they do not even have to exercise their willpower. So this is a study that was published some years ago, and it's based on the reframing effect. So reframing effect is very famous because we know that if you ask someone in a hidden zero format, he will have difficulties in delaying gratification. So if you say, would you prefer $5 today or 10 in a month, maybe he might be puzzled about how to respond and would go with the $5 today. But if you do an explicit zero format, would you prefer $5 today or 0 in a month or 0 today and 10 in a month, people might understand better the question and respond that they would delay the reward. So they would get the $10 in a month. But interestingly, the studies show that there is no difference in the action of willpower. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is considered to be a willpower area, was activating exactly in the same way in the two formats. But what was different was the striatum. So in one case, the salience of the immediate reward was less. So they could understand how to respond, but no willpower here. Again, these are the strategies that usually people work. I mean, it's not that I'm saying that they don't use cognition. They use sometimes cognition like to reappraisal their emotional response modulation. So, for example, you want to work, you think about funny things about your work, you perceive your work as fun, and then you have an emotional response. You put yourself in a situation selection. You go to your office, you don't go somewhere else, you don't go to the bar. You turn your phone off, you don't look at social media, you look at your PC. That is attentional deployment. So this is the fact that temptation inhibiting is very efficient, when we compare this kind of strategy to a willpower strategy, is also true of studies that have been done from the 70s. This is a very famous old studies in which the children were asked to do a very tedious task like copying something, okay? And they were said that actually at some point a distractor would come, Mr. Clown, but they shouldn't have played with Mr. Clown, because if they would have continued doing their task, they would have got a lot of toys in the end. But they gave them strategies to react to this kind of situation. And when they actually had the strategies, I have to do my work. So the willpower strategies, they couldn't resist. But when they were said, for example, that they had to inhibit temptation, like I won't watch Mr. Clown, or they would have to think about the reward, I'll have the new toys, things were going much better. So again, with emotions, we can do a lot of things. There are a lot of studies that actually try to influence our delay of gratification. So they try especially to intervene of our intertemporal discounting, the bias we have on the fact that we prefer to have a reward now instead of waiting, so we discount the later reward. So if you put people in front of very nice videos like these, baby, little dogs, so they will actually they would behave much better in intertemporal discounting. So they might delay gratification better. This is a study in which this was done, for example, and the subjects were supposed to choose between a reward today of $25 or every 6 weeks they could get $30, $35, $40, $45, $50. The interesting thing to notice is that the positive affect helped them to delay gratification when the difference between the sooner reward and the larger reward was sufficient. Like, for example, they said no when they were getting only 30, but they started saying yes when it was 35, 40, and so on. So they need a little bit of difference between the rewards. And trust is very important. So if you ask people if they would invest between $40 now or 65 in 7 days, but the people, so the face they see is an angry face, a neutral face, and a happy face, you may deduce they would choose the larger and later reviews with an happy face, because they perceive this face as much more trustworthy. So trustworthiness is very, very important to delay gratification. And you can do that with children, because only touching the children or caressing them before the task may help them delay gratification. So let me go very quickly to the morality. So I said before that self-control is very moralized, and the kind of views we have is that so what comes from the slow, controlled, and cognitive is good in moral terms, and what comes from fast, intuitive, and emotional is bad. But I think we should, reconceptualize this and try to understand exactly if maybe also the opposite might be the case. So, for example, this is a very, very recent study that showed that actually honest people, they use a lot of emotions when behaving honestly, but they need also rational areas when they are asked to behave dishonestly. So if you are dispositionally honest, you may need this area, which is the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is connected to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it's an area related to inhibition to behave in a dishonest way. So it's true that maybe, like it's shown here, dishonest people use rationality, or inhibition to behave honestly, but honest people use rationality to behave dishonestly. So self-control in this case is not moral at all, if we intend it like that. Also, the link between dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and utilitarianism can be questioned. There is a lot of debate about that. There are studies about brain stimulation. So there is debate because the sample with brain stimulation is very, very little every time. But these findings, for example, the first findings were replicated recently. So if you disrupt the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so you interrupt this kind of activity, you would have expected to have actually less utilitarian responses, but then you get higher, so we don't know why. But if you enhance dorsolateral prefrontal cortex by another technique, the first is transcranial magnetic stimulation, the second is a direct current stimulation. So if you enhance it, you would expect a higher utilitarian response, and then you get lower utilitarian responses. So we need to justify this, because Joshua Green's model, for example, does not predict this kind of results. Another counter-evidence are psychopaths. So psychopaths are those kind of irresponsible, antisocial, but charming, Machiavellian, no empathy, no lack of response people, like serial killers, for example. We know and we identify a series of areas in which they have troubles, like, for example, amygdala again, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but very strangely, psychopaths are incredibly utilitarian. So they behave, this is actually a study on subclinical psychopaths, non-clinical psychopaths, but there are studies also on offenders. And they have an increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we wouldn't take psychopaths as a normative model for our societies. And that's basically a counter-evidence to Joshua Green model again. But again, I think we need to define what utilitarianism is. And there are many very interesting studies made by some scientists and philosophers in Oxford, like Guy Kane, for example, that they are proposing the idea that merely identifying utilitarianism with instrumental harm, using other merely as means, is not really depicting genuinely what utilitarianism is in morality, how it was conceived in morality. And the real goal of utilitarianism was impartial beneficence. So they conceived a scale, for example, to distinguish these two things. Like, for example, people were responding to, would you admit political oppression for a short term to ensure the overall well-being? Or would you keep money that you don't really need and donate it to charity causes? So psychopaths respond yes to the second, but not to the first. So you need a different kind of morality. You need impartial beneficence to be genuinely utilitarian, which is very different from the definition that Joshua Green gave. Let me also say, and I will conclude with this, we need to understand, I think, in this kind of debate, why we have this harm reactive aversion. So why we have this emotion in case there is instrumental harm towards other people. We still don't know. So some psychologists, very important, like evolutionary psychologists like Lida Kosmitz, John Tooby, I'm sure you know, they speculated that maybe evolution selected for this kind of reaction, emotional reaction, because they might be useful for our cooperation, our reciprocation, trust to other people. So we know that that non-utilitarian people, so people who give non-utilitarian responses, are much more chosen as romantic and business partners. And we don't like consequentialist agents, especially when they actually use the sacrifice, the instrumental harm, in a very manipulative way. So we don't like it's not always said like that, but it's especially when their motives are strategic, we don't like the consequentialist. So we have still to find an answer to that. Let me conclude that this is the model of self-control that is much used in neuroethics, so a top-down model. But I think we should work more on conceiving a model that is much more interactive between cognitive functions and emotions. I'm not denying the intervention of cognitive function. I'm basically thinking there might be a vehicle to facilitate emotional regulation. And this is why we need a better model, because this model might have different normative conclusions from the ones that you heard before. Thank you very much. So these are people who have advised me during this project, and I'm really thankful for listening to my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabetta. You know, I thought something when you were talking about the happy man on the, that you don't want to throw him down. But I think that has a lot to do with morality, because we are taught that killing is bad. So if 5 people die because the bus runs over them, we are not killing them. It happens. But if you push somebody, it's deliberate killing, and this is not allowed by our standards of morality. And I think this is why people would refuse to do it. It's like, when you kill a person who is very sick and he wants to die, but law doesn't allow it, and most people feel it's not right.
Yes, you're right. I mean, this was how the dilemma was conceived at first. So it was conceived in 1960s by Philippa Ford, who was using it to discuss euthanasia and abortion then. But I can tell you that I think that, I mean, there were many studies after that in psychology, neuroscience, and actually we cannot really, I think, give a very net distinction between the two. So it's very, very difficult to understand what is the distinction between the two. For example, I find very interesting a response that was given by another author of the classical moral dilemmas debate, which is Judith Thompson, who actually wrote a lot about this, that actually in that case we are interfering with the state of affairs. So it might be that there's something there, like we think that their man could live, while in the other case, the other guy is still entrapped, that there might be the case that the train could go there somehow. So, of course, there is a lot of debate about that, because people contested that it's not familiarity, maybe it's not intentionality, because you have your intentions there in the two cases. It's very, very difficult to know, to trace the distinction between the two, but we have to work on that. It's